My parents died in a car accident 3 weeks after my high school graduation, and the world as I knew it shattered in an instant that June evening. They were driving home for my graduation dinner when a drunk driver crossed the median on Highway 101, and suddenly I was an orphan at 18 with a college acceptance letter and no idea how to navigate life without them. My father had been a successful commercial real estate developer, and my mother ran a boutique consulting firm, so I knew there was money somewhere, but the specifics were mysteries wrapped in legal documents I couldn't understand. Uncle Richard, my father's older brother and a financial advisor, appeared at the funeral in an expensive suit, pulling me aside after the service to promise he'd handle everything. He said my father had made him executor of the estate specifically because he trusted Richard to protect me, to make sure I was taken care of properly. I remember feeling grateful through my grief, relieved that someone responsible would manage the complicated financial matters while I tried to process losing both parents in one horrible moment. The first year after their deaths was a blur of paperwork, grief counseling, and Richard's repeated assurances that everything was under control. He'd sit me down monthly in his home office, surrounded by mahogany furniture and framed credentials, explaining that the estate was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. My father's business had outstanding debts, he claimed, and the investments had taken a hit during the market downturn. He'd slide an envelope across his desk containing $300 in cash, telling me this was all the estate could afford right now, that I needed to be patient and grateful he was working so hard to salvage what remained. I'd accepted my admission to my parents' alma mater, a prestigious private university, but Richard convinced me to defer, suggesting community college made more financial sense, given our circumstances. I worked at a coffee shop and a retail store, living in a cramped studio apartment, eating ramen most nights, while Richard and his family lived in their sprawling suburban home. I visited them for holidays, watching my cousins Chloe and Tyler come home from their expensive colleges, talking about study abroad programs and spring break trips, never questioning why their lives seemed so different from mine. By my mid-20s, I'd cobbled together an associate degree from community college and was working as an administrative assistant, still receiving that same $300 monthly allowance from Uncle Richard. He'd occasionally take me to lunch, always at modest restaurants, where he'd sigh about how disappointed he was that my father hadn't been more financially prudent, how the business collapse had affected the whole family. He made me feel like a burden, like I should be thankful he was still managing what little remained of the estate rather than just washing his hands of the responsibility. Meanwhile, I noticed Richard had retired at 55, something he attributed to smart investing and careful planning. His wife Diane drove a new luxury SUV every few years, and they'd added a pool to their backyard. My cousin Chloe attended Princeton, and Tyler went to USC, both schools with tuition exceeding $60,000 annually. When I asked how they afforded it, Richard would wave dismissively and say something about scholarships and his own savings, making me feel small for even wondering. I stopped asking questions, accepting that some people were just luckier, more financially savvy, better at life than others. Everything changed the summer I turned 27. While cleaning out a storage unit filled with my parents' belongings that I'd been paying for but couldn't bear to sort through, buried in a box of my father's files, I found a letter dated a month before his death, from his attorney to Uncle Richard, outlining the terms of the estate. My hands trembled as I read it 3 times, trying to comprehend what it said. The estate was valued at approximately $2.3 million, including life insurance, property, and investment accounts. My father had explicitly instructed that I receive the full inheritance at age 25, or sooner if I demonstrated financial maturity and stability. There was no mention of business debts, no suggestion of financial collapse, no indication that anything was wrong with the estate's value. The letter was clear, formal, and completely contradicted everything Uncle Richard had told me for 9 years. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit, surrounded by boxes of my parents' memories, feeling something crack open inside my chest. Not just grief anymore, but a burning, clarifying rage that sharpened every thought. I didn't confront Richard immediately because I needed proof beyond a single letter, needed to understand the full scope of what had happened to my inheritance. I spent 2 weeks researching forensic accountants, eventually finding a firm that specialized in estate fraud and embezzlement cases. The initial consultation cost me a week's salary, but the lead accountant, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, listened to my story with an expression that shifted from professional neutrality to visible anger. She said she'd seen cases like mine before, that family members exploiting trust positions was unfortunately common, and that she could trace every dollar if I was prepared for what she might find. I authorized the investigation using money I'd saved for a security deposit on a better apartment, signing documents that gave Patricia access to estate records, bank statements, and court filings. The investigation took 4 months, during which I continued accepting Richard's monthly allowances, attending family dinners, pretending everything was normal, while rage simmered beneath my polite smiles. Patricia called me on a Thursday after 1 in October, her voice tight with professional fury, saying she'd finished the report and I needed to come to her office immediately to review the findings before she sent the final document. The forensic report was 300 pages of meticulously documented theft that made me physically ill to read through. Patricia walked me through it section by section, her finger tracing highlighted transactions that showed exactly how Uncle Richard had systematically drained my inheritance over a decade. He'd started small, transferring $50,000 to his personal retirement account 6 months after my parents died, probably testing whether anyone was watching. When no one questioned it, he'd gotten bolder. $400,000 went to his retirement accounts over 3 years. $160,000 paid for Chloe's Princeton tuition. Another $120,000 covered Tyler's USC expenses. He'd purchased a vacation home in Aspen for $350,000, a property in Cabo for $280,000, and a lake house in Michigan for $190,000. All using my inheritance while telling me the estate was bankrupt. The remaining funds had been spent on luxury cars, home renovations, country club memberships, and investment accounts in his children's names. Patricia estimated the total theft at approximately $1.5 million, not including interest and investment growth I'd been denied. She said the documentation was ironclad, that any prosecutor would consider this a straightforward embezzlement case, and asked if I wanted her to forward the report to law enforcement. I spent a week deciding how to handle the information, torn between wanting immediate justice and wanting to control the narrative of my own story. My coworker Marcus, who'd become a close friend during my years of financial struggle, convinced me that public exposure would be more satisfying than a quiet legal process. He said Richard had spent a decade controlling the story, making me feel small and grateful for scraps, and that I deserved to reclaim my narrative in front of everyone who'd watched me struggle while praising his generosity. When I learned through Facebook that Richard's 60th birthday party was being planned as a lavish celebration at an upscale venue, something clicked into place. I contacted Patricia and asked her to prepare leather-bound copies of the report, one for Richard, one for Diane, and one each for Chloe and Tyler. I wanted them all to see simultaneously, wanted no opportunity for Richard to spin the story or control the damage. I RSVP'd to the party, bought an emerald suit I couldn't afford, and spent the week before rehearsing exactly what I'd say, how I'd stand, where I'd position myself for maximum impact when I destroyed the lie he'd built on my parents' graves. The ballroom was obscenely elegant, with crystal chandeliers and champagne fountains, everything paid for with money Richard had stolen from me. I watched him work the room, accepting congratulations and well wishes, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy tuxedo probably custom made. Diane glowed in her red gown, and my cousins looked happy and successful, completely unaware that their privileged lives had been funded by their father's betrayal of his dead brother's daughter. I waited until Richard stood to give his speech, until he raised his champagne glass and started talking about family and sacrifice, before I made my move. The look on his face when I interrupted, when the waiter handed him that leather portfolio, was something I'll remember forever. Confusion shifting to recognition, shifting to pure panic. Watching Chloe and Tyler read through the report, seeing the horror dawn in their expressions as they realized where their tuition money had actually come from, was devastating and satisfying in equal measure. When I told the room that the district attorney receiving his copy the next morning, Richard collapsed into a chair like a puppet with cut strings. And I felt no sympathy, only a cold, clean sense of justice finally being served. The aftermath unfolded quickly and brutally over the following months. The district attorney did indeed press charges, and the case made local news as a cautionary tale about estate fraud and family betrayal. Richard's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but I refused any agreement that didn't include full restitution and significant prison time. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which every detail of his theft was presented to a jury of his peers, and I testified about the decade I'd spent believing I was a burden, while he lived lavishly on my parents' money. He was convicted of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, sentenced to 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5. The court ordered him to liquidate assets to repay the stolen funds, which meant the vacation homes were sold, retirement accounts were drained, and his children's trust funds were seized. Chloe and Tyler both reached out to apologize, though I told them they weren't responsible for their father's crimes, that they'd been as deceived as I was. Diane filed for divorce before Richard even began his sentence, claiming she'd had no knowledge of the theft, though I suspected she'd chosen not to ask questions about their sudden wealth. With the restitution money, I finally enrolled at my parents' university to complete my bachelor's degree, something I'd dreamed about for 10 years. I was older than my classmates, but I didn't care. Finally, sitting in lecture halls my parents had once occupied, feeling connected to them in a way I hadn't since their deaths. I used part of the recovered funds to establish a scholarship in their names for students who'd lost parents, wanting something positive to come from the nightmare Richard had created. Marcus helped me find a therapist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse, and I spent a year unpacking the psychological damage of being systematically deceived by someone I'd trusted. The therapy helped me understand that Richard's betrayal wasn't about me being unworthy or burdensome, but about his own greed and moral bankruptcy, his willingness to exploit a grieving teenager for personal gain. I graduated with honors 3 years after the trial, and at my commencement ceremony, I carried photos of my parents, finally able to tell them I'd finished what they'd started, that their legacy had survived despite Richard's best efforts to destroy it. Now, at 31, I work as a financial advocate, helping people navigate estate issues and identify potential fraud, using my experience to protect others from the kind of exploitation I endured. I've rebuilt relationships with Chloe and Tyler, who've both been genuinely remorseful and supportive, understanding that they were unknowing beneficiaries of their father's crimes. Richard is currently serving his sentence at a minimum security facility, and I've declined his requests for visits or correspondence, having nothing left to say to him. Diane occasionally sends awkward emails attempting reconciliation, but I've maintained firm boundaries, explaining that while I don't blame her for Richard's choices, I also don't owe her a relationship. The money I recovered has been invested wisely, growing steadily, providing the security my parents intended for me to have all along. Sometimes I visit their graves and tell them about my work, about the scholarship recipients, about the life I've built from the ruins Richard tried to create. I tell them that their trust wasn't misplaced, that I survived, that I fought back, and that justice, though delayed by a decade, was ultimately served. The emerald suit I wore to Richard's birthday party hangs in my closet, a reminder that speaking truth to power, even when it destroys relationships and shatters families, is sometimes the only path to reclaiming your own story and honoring those who can no longer speak for themselves.